Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we can use an experiment using Starburst Candy to teach us about rocks, how they form, and what they can tell us about the history of the Earth.
Before I go too far, we should probably discuss a little bit of what the rock cycle is. The rock cycle is how we refer to the three main types of rocks. We have igneous rocks that formed when molten lava, so liquid rock, melted rock, cools. Now that can either be extrusive, like this volcanic bomb here that was blown out of a volcano, or intrusive, like here we have this crystalline rock identified with the crystals. The other types of rocks, we have sedimentary rocks, which are made up of broken pieces of other rocks, and we have metamorphic rocks that are formed when you have high pressure or temperature conditions put on top of some of these other rock types. We call it a cycle, but this can be done with different versions. By that I mean we can have sedimentary rocks either going this way by having eroded pieces of metamorphic rocks, or with inputs from this way of eroded pieces of igneous rocks. We can also have metamorphic rocks that either started as igneous rocks or started as sedimentary rocks, and by melting any of these three types of rocks, we can make new molten lava, which will solidify to be an igneous rock.
Okay, now we're going to demonstrate how sedimentary rocks form. Now, sedimentary rocks form by the breakdown of other larger rocks. So what we have here is our larger rocks, and in nature, this would be wind and rain and ice and snow works on rocks and slowly breaks out small grains, and then they're transported to rivers. But here we're going to use scissors instead. So this is our weathering of our rocks, and they're breaking down into smaller pieces that are going to go into river systems where they'll be deposited. You can choose any sort of color. So what your sedimentary rock is going to be made up of is the pieces of the rocks from around where the sediments are sourced. So depending on what area that is, it's going to vary what kinds of rocks you'll have. So maybe you just have one that only had yellow. Well, that's completely fine. Also, as sediments go down river systems, different rocks are stronger than others, and the strongest ones are going to be left. So if you only chose one color, then this could be, your rock could be from a further down the river channel where only the strongest grains are left. So I was talking about river channels. Most sediments that we have in the rock record are from the ocean, and the sediments are transported by rivers. Now, as rivers move sediments, the sediments bang against each other and get progressively more and more rounded. So the way we're going to do that with our starburst is we're just going to rub them in our hands. So how rounded you want to make them is going to depend on how large your river system is. So if we did it like this, you see they're somewhat rounded, but they're still pretty oblong. There's still some pointy bits to them, especially the ones I dropped. So if we just keep rolling them some more, and some more, and some more. And now they're getting progressively more rounded. And this means that we're going further and further down our river. So I keep rolling them some more, and some more, and some more. They're starting to get quite rounded, and now they're deposited into the bottom of the river, and then as more and more sediments are laid upon, they're going to get pressed together, and pressed together, and pressed together, and this is forming our rock. And you can see that it is made up of a bunch of different grains that are squeezed together, but you can still see the original fragments that they were made from. Okay, now what we have here is three different versions of are Starburst Rocks. We have this one here, which we rolled much less. So this is mimicking something that was close to source and wasn't transported rivers very much. So the pieces are all quite angular. There's a lot of different varieties. For actual rocks, the weaker rocks would break down first, so you have less colors and different types of rocks on one that's gone further down a river system. And there's even some space and stuff like that before. So this is an example of something that wasn't transported very far, thus we didn't roll it very much in our hands to really round them down.
So this sample here hasn't transported very far from source, and we can tell that because these pieces are quite angular. They still have some fairly kind of pointy edges, maybe slightly rounded. There's big pieces, and there's kind of different types of rocks. There's a lot that's been, so they're all like equally transported, and if this was transported further, the weakest ones would break down faster.
This one is sort of a medium amount of transport. So you can see that everything's quite rounded, but they're still not like spherical or anything like that. And we still have lots of different colors in. So this would be an example of something that has gone maybe halfway down a river system or something like that.
Now this one is kind of like our medium rolled sample, like our Starburst that we rolled for a little while. And you can tell that it's a little bit more rounded, like the Starburst one when we press them together. And also there's been some pieces that probably haven't made it that far. So the weakest ones are now gone, or they're much smaller. And only the stronger ones are a little bit bigger, and they're better rounded.
And our third variety here is now only one type of Starburst. So this is an example of if you just chose one color, well, that would be an example of something that's been transported a long way. And you can see that they're much more rounded than the other ones. So I spent a long time rolling this to get them as round as possible before I squeeze them together.
All right. Now this one's a little bit hard to see. This is more like the one that was only one color that had been rolled a lot, so it was very rounded. And there's almost only quartz left in it. We can see a bit of bedding just from a few darker grains being in there, but mostly it's just one mineral. This suggests that it's been transported a long ways. And all those grains are much smaller than the samples we looked at before, and that's something that happens with transport that we didn't really get with the Starburst. But also those grains are a lot more well-rounded.
Another way to look at these is in what we call a cross-section. So this is a cross-section view of them, and you can see that they're more or less in the same dimension as they are on the outside in the cross-section. Now this is going to be important for our next step, which is going to be seeing what happens to these when we heat them up and squish them. So like rocks, Starburst is going to change when we heat it up and squish it. That'll be the next step. Okay, so to heat them up, what we're going to do is place both of our Starburst rocks into plastic bags. I just chose Ziplocs, and put them into the bowls. Now what we're going to do here is try two different temperatures to see what happens when we have hotter versus colder, and then when we do the next step of putting pressure on it, we're going to do more versus less pressure. So this side, we're going to do warm water, and this side, we're going to do hot water. So kids, if you're trying this at home, get your parents to help with the hot water step. Now we're just going to let those soak and warm up for probably about 5 minutes, and we'll come back and apply some pressure. Okay, those have been sitting for about 5 minutes. Now what we're going to do is apply pressure to it. Now this is going to mimic what happens when rocks were buried really deep in the Earth's crust. As you go deeper, it gets hotter, and because there's a whole bunch of rocks on top of them, the pressure increases, so they're getting more and more squished. So we're going to see one that's kind of buried shallowly, which is our warm water here, and is not going to have as heavy of a thing put on it. So we're going to do this with here, and we're going to squish it with just some nuts. So that's going to sit there, and then that's going to be squishing our rock. And our next one is going to be our really hot water, and we're going to place on it this big bottle of juice, which is going to squish it even more. So this is going to be mimicking shallow burial, and this is mimicking deep burial. So low temperature and low pressure, and this one's high temperature and high pressure. So we're going to let those sit again for probably around 10 minutes or so, and come back and see what they look like. All right, it's been about 10 minutes, so we're going to take the pressure off and see what our rocks look like. Now we can see that the one that was under higher pressure and more temperature is much thinner, and it's been stretched out a lot. So we can see that that we still have, like, we can see the rocks that it started off here, but they've been really elongated. Now we actually get that in metamorphic rocks quite frequently, and I'll just kick to a couple of videos here where I go through looking at actual rocks and how we see this similar thing in actual rocks. Just before we look at actual rocks, I wanted to also cut it in half and give you a close look, so we can see that we can still see some bits of rock in the cross section, even though it's super thin. There's these little whiffs, so it's been stretched out super thin, and we can see the more or less original size actually a little bit better stretched out this way because the pressure was coming down in this direction, and it squished out that original sedimentary rock into these long thin class. Now we're going to actually go look at some actual rocks, and we'll talk about how the pressure and temperature at high pressure temperature ends up stretching out rocks in nature.
Right, this sample illustrates pretty well how stretched out some of these minerals can get. So you can see here where we can see like slight little ellipses, but if we rotate it, they're actually single points. So these are either minerals or rock fragments that have been stretched out super long, sort of like straws in the rocks. They look like layers here, but they look like single points here, and that's because the rock was stretched out. So this is sort of like one of the pieces that had a lot of weight and a lot of heat put on it. And this sample had the most weight and heat put on it, so everything is stretched out into single layers. And this is the sample actually reordering itself, so we have iron-rich layers and more silica-rich layers. So we can't see any of the original textures from that original sedimentary rock in this one.
Okay, and we're back, and now we're going to look at this one that was under lower temperature and less pressure. So we can see that we can still make out most of our original rocks, but they've been squished somewhat. So this is what happens when you're in kind of deep burial, but not super hot or not super high pressure anymore. All right, now we're going to look at a video of some actual rocks that have been squished to sort of this sort of level where we have elongation, but we haven't quite deformed it quite to this level where it's super thin. All right, and again, before we go and look at the actual rocks, I wanted to show the cross section of this one here. That was the lower pressure temperature, and you can see how it's been squished out a bit, and any of the void space that was in there before has been completely closed off, but we can still make out clearly the original pieces of the starburst, even though they're a bit stretched out. And now we'll go look at an actual rock to see how that works in a real world rock situation.
So this rock is more similar to the one that we were looking at where we had less weight and heat applied to it for it to metamorphose. So it's kind of like the warm water and lightweight piece of Starburst that we looked at. And we can really see that we have clear fragments of rock that are in here that have been squished and stretched out.
Okay, so now we've gone through the rock cycle. We talked about sedimentary rocks, which is where we rolled the starburst up and pressed it together. And we talked about metamorphosed rock, where we heated it up and put weight on it, put pressure on it to squish them out. Now the last step is igneous rocks. For this, we're going to take a piece of our metamorphic starburst and we're going to put it in this little boat I made out of baking paper. And I have a link in the text below that will give you a link to make this origami box. And what we're going to do is we're going to heat this up in the microwave. So it'll only take about 10 seconds. And what we'll want to do is put a bowl on top, put it in the microwave, and kids, get your parents to help you with this step. Okay, and now we have the result that's out of the microwave. It actually took me 20 seconds, not 10 as I said before, so you should probably try 20 seconds when you do it yourself. And make sure you put a bowl over top of it, and then just leave it in the microwave to cool, because it'll be extremely hot and really easy to burn yourself. So give it a good 10 minutes in the microwave, and then just put the whole thing straight into the fridge and let it sit in the fridge for another 10 minutes or so, just so it's all cool and hard like this. So it's all cool, we can pull it out. And basically the main thing to see here is that because it solidified so quickly, it's very cold, or is very fine grained. So we're going to look at a fine grained rock coming up, so that we can't really see any crystals or anything like that. So we're going to go look at a fine grained rock that is a little bit more like this, and that means it's quenched really fast if it has a small grain size and we can't really see the grains. And then we'll look at one that's a little bit coarser grained, which means that it solidified much slower, so different grains were able to grow more.
All right, now this is an igneous rock, and it solidified relatively quickly, so we can only see a few little crystals in there, but mostly it's pretty hard to see. This would be a little bit like the starburst that we melted again. If we were able to crystallize them or cool them slower, we might start to get crystals kind of like this, though we couldn't see any crystals in our starburst. Now this one was what we would have if we cooled it even slower and gave a lot of time for the individual crystals in sugar for the starburst, but in here it's other minerals, to form their own crystals, which would then be larger. And if we had even more time, the crystals would get even bigger.
Okay, now I'd like to go into kind of a follow-up on what we've gone throughout this little workshop, and sort of revisit the rock cycle and how everything we did fits into the rock cycle. So we started off with full pieces of starburst, and those were I'm going to call it our original igneous rocks. And then we weathered those rocks. So if this was an actual rock, we were on a mountainside, wind, rain, freeze thawing effect. In the winter, we'll break off pieces of rock and they'll fall down the mountainside and eventually into streams. And that's what we did with our scissors. We cut up the pieces of the starburst into little pieces, and then we simulated the stream action by rolling them back and forth in our hands. And if we did it for a long time, those pieces got really, really round, and that would be similar to if they went a long way down a river system. Or if we decided that we didn't really want to get our hands all sticky and we just squeeze them together in their angular shape, those would be more akin to something close to source, so it hasn't had time to get rounded. So as it goes down river systems, they're going to get progressively more rounded. Similarly, depending on what we chose, if we chose just one color, this would again be more like something that went further down the river system. So this is a rounded single mineral rock, whereas this is a more angular multi-mineral rock. And we would be able to tell that these were deposited with less transport, and these were deposited with more transport. And then we heated up our samples by putting them into plastic bags and varying hot temperature of water, and then also put them under pressure. So higher temperature and more weight put on them, or more pressure, the Starburst or rocks got stretched out even thinner. Whereas less temperature, pressure, we had less deformation. So this would be like a low metamorphic grade rock, didn't get too deeply buried in the crust, and therefore didn't get as much pressure or as heated up as this one, which would be much more deeply buried. Then the last step was to melt it all and go back to our molten lava, which was what was in our little boat in the microwave. And then when that solidified, it made our new igneous rock, which then we could have gone back into the cycle. So I hope you've enjoyed this and found it informative, and I hope you'll continue to be interested in geology.